I'm Mordecai Mawk Arnold, Mawk, M-A-W-K, Arnold. Um, in Fairhope, more widely known as Mawk than as Mordecai, probably. And that brings up the question of the name itself. My mother was Mordecai Roberts, and Mordecai Roberts Arnold, but she was a native of Mobile, grew up in Mobile, educated in Mobile, and people in Mobile, natives of Mobile, still don't know how to put an R in a word. So she never ever said her own name correctly. She never said Mordecai unless she was actually explaining it to someone. She said Mordecai. And when I was born, which was 87 years ago, 1924, I had a 6-year-old brother, a 4-year-old sister, a 2-year-old brother, and for several days they heard Mama speaking to the new baby. And Mama would say, "All right, Mordecai, here's your bottle. Mordecai, time to change your diaper. All right, Mordecai, that's all right. Come on, settle down. Time to take your nap." And Claude and Sue and Pat listened to it for a few days, said, "What do you think she's calling it?" And finally they said, "I think she's calling it Mawk." She said, "Mordecai, Mordecai this, Mordecai, all right, Mordecai." And they said, "I think she's calling it Mawk." So they named me Mawk, M-A-W-K. And that has stuck for all this 87 years. And in some cases, it even made official records because some of my report cards at Troy State Teachers College were actually made out in the name of Mawk Arnold. And I know that came about because students, my classmates, worked in the registration office, and when they got the report card in from a teacher, they just automatically said Mawk. So I've lived with that for all these years. It doesn't make much difference because Mordecai is almost as rare a name as Mawk. So I've had many, many interesting experiences with my name through these years. But I'm here today basically to talk about Fairhope, Alabama, and my family's journey to Fairhope and through Fairhope. I said my mother was a native of Mobile, but she attended Daphne Normal School in Daphne, Alabama, 8 miles up the road from Fairhope. And Daphne Normal School was a 2-year teacher training school, and she graduated from Daphne Normal School and went to teach at Carroll Plantation out in the Theodore section of Mobile, and was teaching there when one day a young man, as she described it, riding a fine bay horse, rode up to this one-room school building where Mama and Mary Burford worked together teaching school. And the young man said his name was Jack Arnold, and he had injured his hand, cut it some way in his work, and wanted to know if they had water that he could get to wash his hand and dress it. So Mama and Mary helped Daddy get his hand washed and dressed, and he went about his business. And as he left, Mary said to Mama, "Hey, I don't want you fooling with my Mr. Arnold." And Mama said, "I'm not interested in your old Mr. Arnold." That was the 12th day of April of 1914, and 1916 it was, of 1916. And she said, "I'm not interested in you, old Mr. Arnold." But on the first day of June of 1916, they married. So somewhere along the interest grew. And shortly after they married, World War I was going on, and Daddy had been a welder part-time. He was a native of Waxahachie, Texas, but he had done some acetylene welding and had injured an eye and lost almost all of his vision in that one eye. So he tried to join the U.S. Army for World War I, but was declined because of his eyesight. But he wanted to have some part in the war effort. So he found that the Ford Motor Company was building military vehicles in Flint, Michigan, in Detroit. And so he and Mama moved to Michigan, and Daddy went to work there as a welder with the Ford Motor Company. At that time, our first of 8 children was born. Claude was born in Flint, and then Jacqueline, whom we all call Sue, was born in Flint, Michigan. And they worked there, Daddy worked there until 1918, when he moved to, let's see, it must have been 1920. They moved back to Texas. And by this time, Claude was 2 years old and Sue was a baby. And they moved back to Texas, and Daddy did a variety of farm work, and then settled down to work on the dairy farm of Bun Hay, who was my daddy's sister's husband. My Aunt Dee Hay and Uncle Bun were operating a dairy farm in Tyler, Texas. So they settled down there. But Mama always wanted to come back to Alabama. And it turned out that she had a specific reason, not only because of her roots in Alabama, but because when she was in the Daphne Normal School, she learned that a lady named Marietta Johnson had started in 1907 a school in Fairhope that she called the Organic School, School of Organic Education. And her idea was that children have an automatic, inborn desire to learn. They're going to learn regardless of what we do. Any parent who wonders about that only has to stop to think for a moment about how many, many things it is that our children learn that we wish they hadn't learned. But they learn them because they have a normal aptitude to learn. They want to learn. Mrs. Johnson recognized this and understood that this natural bent for children to learn could be followed by the school system and used to really make education really practical for children. And so she learned, when she was teaching in the Minneapolis-St. Paul school system in Minnesota, she learned about the idea of education and a lot of ideas about education. And so she decided that she wanted to start her own school. At the same time, there were people from Minnesota who had joined the people from Indiana and Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin who had moved to Fairhope, Alabama, to form a Fairhope single tax colony. There was no Fairhope when they came. There was just a very small village, only a very few homes on the eastern shore where Fairhope is now. And they came here to decide to establish the single tax colony. And their idea was that that individuals should not actually own the land, that the land should belong to everybody, and the individuals should own what improvements they put on the land, and that is their own, but they should not own the land. So they established a single tax colony, and the single tax colony procedure was that they bought up all the land that they could acquire in the area, and deeming the idea that they had a fair hope of success, they named their new community, the colony area, Fairhope, Alabama. And therein was the beginning of Fairhope in 1884, and which, by the way, was the year that my father was born in 1891, and Mama was born in 1898. 98, I think. in Mama in Mobile, Daddy in Waxahachie, Texas. But Mama had always heard of Fairhope, heard of the organic school when she was in Daphne Normal School in the years 1913, 14, before she went to teach at Carroll Plantation. And she wanted to come back and get her children in the school. And so they finally came back, packed up everything in August of 1929, loaded everything that they owned on the back of a Model T pickup truck, and started the trek from Tyler, Texas to Fairhope, to Mobile, because Mama's family still lived in Mobile. She had two sisters, Aunt Grace Byrne, wife of Pat Byrne, who was at one time the sheriff of Mobile County, and other sister, Aunt Grace Hargrove, the wife of Harry Hargrove, who was one of the very first Mobile bar pilots guiding the ships in and out of Mobile Harbor. And so Mama came back, and the way I tell it was Mama and Daddy and 5 8/9 children loaded on that Model T truck and made the trip back. And the reason I say 8/9 is because my sister Mary Emma, who became known as Mimi, was just a month away from arriving. And we came back and stopped for about a month, a little bit more than a month, at Aunt Claude Burns' home at 1836 Old Shell Road in Mobile. And then for that first school year, Mama enrolled Claude and Sue and Pat in the Chickasaw Elementary School, and then by the end of that year, moved the family. Daddy got a job working on Uncle Pat's farm near Bay Minette on what is now known as Highway 225, running from where I-65 and State Road 225 runs south through Stockton down to Spanish Fort, Alabama. And Daddy was working and running the farm for Uncle Pat there on a sharecropper system. And while he was there, Elsie was born. And Elsie was the 7th child. And she was born there at Uncle Pat and Aunt Claude's farm we call it in Bay Minette, but it's out west of Bay Minette and south of I-65. And but all this time, Mama still had her desire to get her children in the organic school. So in 1931, she persuaded Daddy to find work in Fairhope, and he found a job with Wallace Malone, working the Malone farm out 4 miles east of downtown Fairhope at an area that is at this day is called State Road 181, running north and south for parallel with Fairhope, with Section Street in Fairhope, and 4 miles from downtown Fairhope. And Mama entered Claude and Sue and Pat and Mawk at the organic school that year. So we began 4 of us that year. And then 2 years later, Grace joined us. 2 years after that, Elsie joined in. And Elsie had been born at the Byrne home in Bay Minette and had moved to Fairhope. And now, while we were working at the Malone farm, Daddy and Mama had one more baby, Jody. So that made 8 children, 8 of us. And eventually all 8 of us went through the organic school. Claude and Sue and Pat entered at a little bit farther along, but I was the first one to enter the first grade, and then Elsie and Jody entered at the kindergarten level. Grace entered at the first grade level, and we all went through Fairhope, through school in Fairhope at the organic school. And we all still remain active and related to it. I still remain as a member emeritus of the Board of Managers of the school after all these years. For 4 years, I was the director and principal of the school after a long time in other occupations. My family remains very active in Fairhope today, although my sister Elsie is the only one of the 8 children who still lives in Fairhope. I married in 1949 while I was a student at Troy State Teachers College, which is now Troy University at Troy, Alabama, and married Alice Morrison from Evergreen, Alabama. And while I was there, I was a member of the Marine Corps Reserve, because as soon as World War II started, first Claude immediately joined the U.S. Navy when World War II began after Pearl Harbor, and Pat followed very closely behind him and joined the U.S. Army Air Corps. And then as soon as I graduated from organic in June of 1943, I joined the Marine Corps. And the 3 of us served throughout World War II, except that unfortunately Pat's time ended short because in 1944 he was flying a formation training flight in the Army Air Corps, and a plane that was above him in the formation hit some kind of a air pocket or some kind of turbulence that caused that plane to make a sudden drop, and it dropped down and hit Pat's plane, and the 2 planes crashed and the 2 pilots were killed. So Pat passed away at that time. Claude went on to be the bosun aboard Navy PT boat and made the landing at Normandy, putting troops ashore there as his boat. And while he was there, another Navy ship nearby was hit by enemy fire bombardment, and the ship sank, and many of the sailors aboard the ship were thrown into the water, wounded, and some killed. And Claude, having grown up in Fairhope and grown up in Mobile Bay, because we all learned to swim as soon as we could walk here in Fairhope, in Mobile Bay, and the end of the Fairhope Pier. And Claude was a very strong swimmer, so he went in the water and began pulling sailors out. But when the ship that had been hit actually finally went all the way under, the undertow from it, the underdraft, grabbed him and pulled him under. And he essentially drowned at that time. He was pulled out of the water by his shipmates, thrown on a pile of bodies that they had pulled out and that Claude had helped pull out, and presumed dead. But in a few moments, someone said, "Hey, that one twitched." And they began resuscitation efforts and managed to revive him. And he went back and in a few minutes he was back active and back at the helm of the PT boat. During the time he was out, though, he had an out-of-body experience where he felt that he went to heaven. Saw our grandmother from Waxahachie, Texas, met her there, chatted with her, said he wanted to go and join Mama and Daddy, but grandmother told him, "No, Claude, it's not your time yet. There's been a mistake, but we'll be waiting for you when you come back." And Claude was revived. That was when he was revived by his shipmates on the PT boat. He went back to work, was later sent to the Naval Hospital at Great Lakes, Illinois, for treatment and recovery, and from there was reassigned to active duty and was on the PT boat squadron in the Philippines with President Kennedy. At the time, President Kennedy's PT boat was sunk. So Claude had quite an experience before the war ended. I joined the Marine Corps and went through training boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, and then radar schools at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, a few months at Cherry Point, North Carolina, and then was shipped out to Guam, where I served as a radar technician, maintaining the radar, long-range search and direction radar for our Marines there on the island of Guam. And then while we were on Guam, the island of Peleliu was recaptured by the Marines, and we moved down from Guam and joined those Marines who had already captured Peleliu and set up our radar, and were operating there until after the war ended. I remember I was at the island of Peleliu when the USS Independence was sunken by the Japanese a few days after the war had been officially declared over, but the Japanese ship had not received the information that they were through, and they sank the Independence, and survivors from the Independence were brought to our island of Peleliu in the Palau group. I was on Peleliu until September, and then we moved up and made a short stop on Okinawa, just preparing to move up to China, and we moved up to Peking, China, and I served out the rest of my overseas tour in Peking and came home from China in June of 1946. As soon as I came home, my mother was already attending school at Troy State Teachers College, getting her bachelor's degree because she had gotten a 2-year associate degree from the Daphne Normal School, and now she wanted a full 4-year degree. So she was spending her summers at Troy State Teachers College and then teaching school in Mobile during the school year. And I stopped on my way home to visit her on campus at Troy and immediately decided that's where I wanted to go to school. And I signed in and began school there in September of 1946. I graduated in August of 1950. The Korean War was already in progress, and being in college on a Marine Corps Reserve program, I went right back to active duty and went back to work as a radar technician in the Marine Corps. I was on orders almost aboard a troop ship to go to Korea when I got a change of orders to go to another advanced radar course that was a 32-week course, and by the time that 8-month course was finished, the war in Korea was winding down, and so my orders were changed, and when I graduated from that advanced radar course, I went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and went back to my radar work. I remained a radar technician as an enlisted man. I went from private, made PFC out of boot camp, rose up to a staff sergeant, went to tech sergeant, which was a grade that no Marine today even heard of because we dropped that term and that grade in 1958 when we changed from 7 enlisted grades to 9 enlisted grades. And I went on and stayed in Marine Corps radar, working as a radar technician, and worked up to warrant officer. I applied for warrant officer candidates course at Quantico, Virginia. I got that assignment and went to Quantico as a master sergeant at the time. When I went to Quantico for the warrant officer candidates course, I had a rather interesting experience in that time, because by now I was 42 years old and my colleagues in the course were ranging from about 26 down to 22. So I became pappy of that group and completed the warrant officer course and was immediately assigned to duty on the island of Okinawa as a radar officer. And while on Okinawa, I made an application for I was a warrant officer first grade at that time, and I wrote to Headquarters Marine Corps and requested assignment to the informational services field, which is a public relations combat correspondence is the title today. And because I had worked on several different occasions as collateral duty as the public relations informational services combat correspondent, and I requested that change of military occupational specialty, MOS. I left Okinawa with orders to go to a 52 weeks course in airborne radar avionics. But when I reached San Francisco coming home from Okinawa, I had a change of orders to go to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and change over into the public information field. And then I did my final 16 years in the Marine Corps, 18 years enlisted as a radar technician, and 16 then as the combat correspondent or public information officer, public affairs officer. When I reached the grade of major, I worked up from warrant officer to second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, major, and I retired in 1977 after 34 years total service, which included the time that I had been in Troy on my Marine Reserve program. When I graduated from the Marine Corps, I call it graduating because my life has been one of education. And so when I retired from the Marine Corps, I immediately went to Auburn University on a graduate assistant program to gain a master's degree. And I got my Master of Arts in College Teaching at Auburn University, and from there transferred. I taught for 4 years at Auburn, teaching speech communication and public relations, and then I transferred to Troy University, and which had been my undergraduate alma mater when it was Troy State Teachers College, and I taught at Troy for 4 years, and then transferred to University of Miami at Coral Gables, Florida, as a debate coach and communications teacher. And I taught there until my wife, Alice, became declared terminally ill with pancreatic cancer. And she wanted to go back to Auburn, and where our two of our daughters had already graduated from Auburn University, and the third one was in Auburn University at that time, and we had been there for 7 years when I was teaching there. So we moved back to Auburn and until Alice passed away. And shortly after her death, I moved to Mobile and remarried and went to work at the organic school in Fairhope, back to my original roots. And so that journey for us was, for me, was from Tyler, Texas, through Mobile, through Beminette, to Fairhope, 12 years in the organic school, 34 years in the United States Marine Corps, 4 years at Troy University, 4 years at Troy in teaching after I left graduate school at Auburn, and teaching for 4 years for 7 years at Auburn, and then down through Troy and back to Fairhope and back to the organic school. And I still remain close to it, as does my sister Elsie, who now is the one member of the family who fully lives full-time in Fairhope. But when I say the family, I'm speaking only of Jack and Morty Arnold's children and their children. But our nephews and nieces are numerous. There are about 50 members of the family that live in Fairhope and work in Fairhope and go to school in Fairhope. And I think there are 14 members of the family that went through the organic school when I start counting nephews and nieces, in addition to the 8 of us who went through the organic school. So we've all remained very active, and the organic school has been a great part of our journey. And anybody who grew up in Fairhope and spent any time in Fairhope in those years that I cover here, from 1931 until now, had to be also a part of the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation, because the Single Tax Corporation still operates actively. The Gaston family, E.B. Gaston, Ernest Berry Gaston, was the primary founder of the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation in 1884, and then the corporation remains active today as a major part of the city of Fairhope. And so that, of course, is a part of the FAP journey. And growing up in Fairhope in the days when I was growing up was a tremendous amount of fun for youngsters. And I think it is today. I think my nephews, grandnephews, and grandnieces, and great-grandnephews and nieces who are growing up in Fairhope, they probably still have as much fun as we did. And when I grew up, the Fairhope Pier was still a landing spot for the Mobile Bay boats. The Bay boat was a boat that would load passengers in Mobile, cross 12 miles across Mobile Bay to land at the Fairhope Pier and unload passengers at the end of the Fairhope Pier. Now, when we first came to Fairhope, the trolley tracks still ran out the pier, but the trolleys had stopped running, because originally, when the Fairhope Pier first built, it was built to be a port for the Mobile Bay boats that transported people from Mobile across the bay to Fairhope and Daphne and Point Clear. Those were the major, and Montrose, those were the major ports here. And so there was the one main port at Fairhope, and there used to be a trolley car that ran out to the end of the pier to unload cargo, not passengers as much as cargo. And then that trolley car ran up to the top of the hill, up to just about the point where I'm sitting right now, because I'm sitting almost on the junction of Section Street and Fairhope Avenue, and that was the major, and is still the major intersection in the city of Fairhope, and at that time the village of Fairhope. And the trolley car came up the hill and unloaded and went back down the hill to meet the next boat when it came. We, as children, lived in the bay, and that's because if we lived anywhere near walking distance to the bay, and near could be as far away as 4 miles where we lived, but we went to the bay any time we could to swim in Mobile Bay. At another time, my family moved from the Malone farm in 1936. We moved to the Pine Needles building, which was a building that had been abandoned and left vacant by the Pine Needle Women's Club. And the Pine Needles was a large 3-story building, the only building that my family ever lived in that was actually had space for all 8 children, Mama and Daddy and 8 children. And now today, that very same building is post 199 of the American Legion, Fairhope American Legion. And it remains very active today as the Fairhope American Legion Club. And that club is something I'm a member of.
I want to make sure
Yes.
we're not out of tape. Okay. I'll make a change it. No, we're doing okay. We have another 20 minutes, about 20 minutes.
All right.
So continue, excuse me.
All right. I was saying that we lived in the bay, and the year that we lived at the Pine Needles building, the Legion Club building, Jody at that year was only 3 years old. As a matter of fact, I think she may have had her 3rd birthday there. But we took Jody down, and Elsie, of course, was only 5 years old. And the Legion Club building, the building we lived in at that time, our home, was just walking. I mean, we just stepped down a flight of steps in front of the building and walked right down into the bay. We had a little short pier there that had been left from the ladies' club, had built a very short little pier there, maybe 100 feet long, going out into the water. It took us out to the end of that little pier to a depth of, at high tide, it might be 6 feet deep. At low tide, it would be 3.5, 4 feet deep. And we children spent a great deal of our time in the bay that year. And then when we moved up to eventually ended up on Magnolia Avenue in Fairhope, and that was still in easy walking distance of the bay, and so we continued to live in the bay. When I was in high school, all of my high school friends met at the bay, and at that time we had a dance club had a 2-story dance club down at the bay that was called the Casino. And the casino did have slot machines, but that was the only thing that was casino about it. It had slot machines, nickel and dime and quarter slot machines, but it had a dance floor on the first floor and a dance floor on the second floor. The second floor would be the site for a Friday night or Saturday night dance with a band, and there would be a live band that would play music for dancing. And I'm speaking now of the 1930s and 1940s and those years up until the late 1950s. That casino was still there. And later they added a bowling alley in there, and so that was a center for recreation for all young people of Fairhope from any age that the parents could bring down to the bay, and then the teenagers centered on the casino and the bay. I remember that a friend of mine, Stephen Riggs, and his friend Curtis Willard built an outdoor movie theater against the bluff, with the back of the audience facing the back of the audience to the bay, sitting in seats that faced the bluff, and the screen, the movie screen, was up against the bluff. And Steve and Curtis, and Steve's wife, Aline, for a number of years, operated an outdoor movie theater, a walk-in movie theater there at the bay. And so our lives continued to circle around that even after we were growing up, and Steve was married. I think maybe Curtis married during the time they were working there. They had each worked as projectionists at the Fairhope Theater at the corner of Fairhope Avenue and Summit Street. No, yes, Fairhope Avenue and Summit Street, and they had worked as projectionists at the Fairhope Theater at the time I worked at as the janitor. And often at night when the movie was over, while Steve and Curtis and I would go down to the bay again. So the bay was still it. When I was probably in 1939, I had gotten a Mobile Press Register newspaper route, delivering the newspaper to Battles Wharf and Point Clear area. And my brother Claude, who by now had graduated from high school and was working as a surveyor and in Fairhope before World War II started, and he bought me a bicycle, and the bicycle had a luggage rack over the rear fender, and sometimes Steve and Curtis and I would go down to the bay, and the three of us, Curtis would ride on the luggage rack behind, I would ride the bicycle, and Steve and Riggs would ride on the handlebars, and I would pump the bicycle as fast as I could out on the wooden planks of the pier and ride off the end of the pier. We'd dive into the water. At the pier being wooden, it had crossbar braces underneath the pilings, and we could climb back up onto the pier, climbing up those braces, climb back up, hoist the bicycle back up, the three of us working together, and we'd go back 20 or 30 yards back down the pier and ride back out and dive in again that way. We had just any number of things. And of course, in those days, no one had even heard the name television, so we didn't have to worry about that. We listened to radio and saw black and white movies, and then about 1930, when was Gone with the Wind was one of the first color movies maybe, and then color came in, and we were working at the theater when color film first came, and we experienced that. Fairhope, being the type of town it was and being an experimental town to begin with, it was full of characters, and we kids were characters in our own right, and a lot of the adults were characters. I remember that Anton Aranza was one of our neighbors when we lived out on the Malone farm, and Anton Aranza was a Austro-Yugoslavian who had come to the United States some years before we moved to Fairhope, and he lived just a half mile away from us out there in East Fairhope, and he was one of our friends, and he was a character who kept a Model T truck running, but he kept it hoisted up on blocks off of the tires, and he only brought it down once in a while to test it and be sure it would still run. but very, very seldom ever drove it. But he kept it running always, but he would hoist it up on blocks and maintain it. And I remember that one of our favorites of the Arnold family children, we liked to go down to Anton's house and visit with him and hear his stories. And of course, he spoke with a distinct Austro-Hungarian accent, so we enjoyed that. And he would give us a drink. He made sweetened water. He would take water and mix it with sugar and then put it out in the sun in a glass jug and let it sit in the sun for a day or two and sort of cook that way. And then he would offer us a drink of sweetened water. And so Jody and Elsie and Mimi and Grace and I and Pat used to spend a lot of time that way. Claude and Sue had kind of outgrown that, but we remembered that. So Antone was one of our favorite characters. At the corner of Fairhope Avenue and Section Street, we used to have periodically a strongman contest. Gaston Motor Company was on the corner where the Renaissance Cafe and some other businesses are right now. And on that corner and across the opposite side of the street was McCain's Hardware. And they used to have a strongman's contest, and Antone would enter that, and Harvard Gooden would enter that, and a number of other of the young men of Fairhope would meet on a Saturday, and they would have weightlifting contests. And one of the contests was to lift up a Model T truck. They would lift up the front end of it. They would lie down on their back and lift up on the axles and lift the front end of the truck and see who could lift that. And I remember that was one of the things that they did. So we always had a wide variety of activities in addition to all of the things that we had done in school. Folk dancing was a major part of our school at the organic school, because we started out originally doing the Old English folk dances, Old English country and Morris dances, and then we began doing the international dances. And Vytautas Finidars Zarene Balajus, a Lithuanian from Chicago, came down in 1940 to teach folk dancing for us. Mr. Paul Fredericks Sr. Was our folk dancing teacher before. Kenny Kane taught folk dancing part of the time. Jimmy Lowell taught folk dancing part-time. Mrs. Piney Gaston played the piano for our folk dancing and for many, many years, and we always danced to piano accompaniment. We always had a pianist who played for it. Jimmy Lowell was our pianist for a number of years, and Mrs. Gaston was. I remember that in Fairhope growing up, nicknames were the norm. I said that I was called Mawk, and as well known as Mawk, widely known as Mawk, as it was by Mordecai, maybe more, but so. And we all had nicknames. My classmates were Myron Horton Lowell, but we called him Marnie. But Marnie was a little bit shorter than most of us, and he got the name Squatty and became Squatty Lowell. And Squatty adopted that name as his regular name when he founded his construction company in Metairie, Louisiana, after graduating from Auburn University. He still used the name Squatty Lowell at his construction company in Metairie, Louisiana, down in New Orleans. And Big Boy Stimpson was Owen Stimpson's brother, and we called him Big Boy. and we didn't call Owen Owen, we called him Odie. And their sister was Laura, but we called her Sissy. And she was Sissy Stimson to all of us. Dooley Swift, who was actually named Harriet, but we all called her Dooley. And I don't know how she got that nickname, but I know that it was so well known that when her graduation from high school came and it was time for her to get her diploma, I remember that Mr. Alexander was our principal, and Mr. Alexander would pass the diploma to Mrs. Johnson, Marietta Johnson, who was still with us at that time, as up through 1938. And Mrs. Johnson was then delivering the diploma to the graduate. And when it came time for Dooley Swift, Mr. Alexander read Harriet Swift. And Mrs. Johnson got a puzzled look on her face and said, Harriet? And Dooley walked up, and Mrs. Johnson said, oh, Dooley. And I tell that story because that illustrates that the nicknames were so common that even our school founder and director, Marietta Johnson, knew us by our nicknames, and she knew Dooley by her nickname so well that she didn't even immediately recognize that her name was Harriet. Of course she knew that, but she was thinking Dooley, and we had those nicknames like that. David Allen still lives in Fairhope, but for us he was Burhead. Burhead, are you listening? He's still here with us. Unfortunately, Steve and Curtis are gone, as are so many of my high school friends and childhood friends. But Fairhope is still, even though I live in Daphne 8 miles away, I still think Fairhope is my permanent home. And I still think that this is where my journey has taken me. It took me all the way through 34 years in the Marine Corps, service 14 months in Vietnam, 7 months in China, a year in the South Pacific in World War II, and many places, back to Japan for Marine Corps assignments because I stayed in until 1977, had tours in far north Japan at Misawa Air Force Base, 2 Marines on an Air Force base, and if you don't think that was a wonderful tour, you just can't imagine what 2 Marines, only 2 Marines on an Air Force base, what a fine time we had. I was a captain at the time, and Doug Bland was a staff sergeant at the time, and we had a wonderful time there. And now today, I still have a tremendous joy visiting at the Fairhope Museum and at the Organic School Museum that Maggie Mosteller Graham now operates, and still enjoy going there and serving on the board of that museum. And so our journey continues.